Welcome to the Montana Majority Report's special segment. Pro-Tem Kenneth Bogner sits down with our special guest, Leslie Hiner, a national leader in educational freedom who advocates for parental choice in K-12 education and currently serves as Vice President of Legal Affairs at EdChoice. Together, they discuss educational freedom, homeschooling, the impacts COVID had on education, and Montana's infamous Espinoza Case. Listen in.
All right, I am here with Leslie Hiner, the Vice President in Legal Policy at EdChoice. Welcome, and
Thank
welcome
you.
to Montana, although this has not been your first time here in Montana.
Not my first time, no.
When did you first come to Montana?
Oh, the first time was in November of 2008. And I remember it so vividly, and I think people may relate to this. When I showed up in Bozeman, there was an event that was put together by Jeff Laszloffy, and he brought all kinds of different diverse people who were both for and against school choice to just have an educational session for a couple days. When I arrived, it was 70 degrees and sunny in November in Montana.
Wow.
I thought, wow, I didn't know Montana was like this. And the next day there was a blizzard. So,
You were in Montana, yes.
I learned about Montana early, yeah, and I just loved it. Loved the people I met there and the kind of dedication that people had. It was pretty obvious.
What are some of those changes you've seen in educational freedom since the first time you came to Montana?
Oh, I've seen quite a bit. In the beginning, the story was that they were really trying very hard to create a way that parents could access different educational options for their kids. And at the time, I took a look at the public school system, and it was better than some. But even in the best systems, if a school doesn't fit your child's learning needs, then it's the wrong school. And that's just the long and short of it. And then what do you do? Well, that's a pretty big question if you're the parent who's facing that question. And so they just weren't able to get school choice bills kind of over the finish line. So in January of 2009, Jeff Essman was in the Senate then and proposed a tax credit scholarship bill. And the people who showed up to testify in favor of that bill, it surprised everybody. First of all, I was told that they had never seen so many people show up to testify in a bill in just a Senate Ed committee hearing. So that was unique. And then there were people just from all walks of life. There were some people from a couple of the different tribal councils, and there were people who homeschooled and people who were from private schools and people who had heard about charters and thought, well, this whole idea of giving parent choices seemed like a good one to them. So that really was that beginning time when people really took this issue to heart. What I saw after that, of course, the bill did not pass, and those who were against it did everything they could to try to intimidate me. But yeah, that wasn't going to happen. Good try, but no. But then the ideas that began to flow from people, I got phone calls so often. Well, what do you think about this? So there's the tax credit scholarship. And then, well, what about doing a straight voucher? Well, what about these charter schools? And people had the most creative, innovative ideas that were all centered around the core idea, which is the thing that matters, is that there is a parent in this state whose child is in a school where the child is not thriving, and that parent needs some assistance to be able to get that child into a school where the child can learn and then thrive, which on the face of it seems like that should be a goal for everybody. It's not really has nothing to do with the school, but it has everything to do with making sure that a child can learn. That's the bottom line. And that has just continued to grow over time. And I have to mention also The people that I met in November of 2008, they are still, all these years later, they are still advocating for educational choice. They're still very creative. They were dedicated then, and they're dedicated now.
And we're seeing that dedication come to fruition. In 2023, we passed the School Choice Act, and are trying to build on that now in 2025. And those people are still out there fighting for educational freedom. Can you talk a little bit about some legislation that's coming through Montana this 2025?
I can. Well, and I would like to speak also to the community choice schools, the charter schools, because I have some experience with that. We, in Indiana, I live in Indiana, we passed our charter school law in 2001. Our first charters opened up in 2002. And along with a handful of friends, I opened one of our first charter schools in Indiana. And it's not easy opening a school. I could tell you that. But the experience that I had in actually participating, not just at a legal level or a policy level, but at a real hands-on in the school, making sure there's enough toilet paper in the school, that, all of that, at that level, and having that connection with our teachers and the parents and the kids, by far one of the best things that I've ever done in my life. I saw the stories of the children who were so directly impacted. And I think it's important for people to know that, especially when a school choice program begins, and I think you saw some of this when the tax credit scholarship program was passed then in 2015, that if a parent is making a decision to move a child to a different educational resource, that's not an easy decision. Parents don't come to this easily. It requires thought, and they have to have a reason for doing it. In the early years, those parents who have been struggling with this, maybe their kids have been bullied, and kids typically, when they're bullied in school, they all go to the back of the classroom, they get real quiet, they're not learning much, they're certainly not thriving, and a parent will see that right off. Parent will notice that right away. So when the opportunity comes to find a different way of education that might work for that child who is obviously not thriving, that parent is going to be the first one to say, hey, I need some help. I want in. And we experienced that in my charter school, so much so that people started calling us alternative schools in the beginning, because these kids came to us and they couldn't read and they couldn't do math, and they didn't know what it meant to behave. I mean, they just didn't know what it was. We learned pretty quickly, we need to teach them what this is. Teach them what it means to be a good citizen and to behave, and along with teaching them how to read and do math. It was a fantastic experience. And so now I'm just so glad that Montana is in this position. I trust that your courts will reach the correct decision, and community charters will be able to grow and do great things for the kids here in Montana, much like they've done in Indiana and in other states. But in addition to that, we have found, especially, I'd say over the last 10 years, and this is nationwide, that parents, they love the idea, okay, here's a charter, we could do that. And in places where there are vouchers or other tax credit scholarships, parents like that. But parents are also really creative. It's part of the funnest part of my job is talking to parents. They come up with really great, innovative ideas. Well, my child's a little slow, but, is there a therapist out there or somebody like that who could maybe help my child to learn how to learn? So that's happening all over the country. Parents love this. The result is the kids who were not thriving are now. And the happiness quotient has just gone sky high for these families who participate in choice. And so now there is a MAPS bill proposed, and the MAPS bill begins with that tax credit component, much like your tax credit scholarship program. But it's very careful to make sure that every family, every child in the state can access this form of educational choice. And not only that, but it also creates that avenue for a parent who knows that their child may need some tutoring, may need some testing in different areas, or maybe the child is really gifted in math. Okay, might need to go talk to somebody who's really gifted in math, maybe take some courses from a variety of different places. This MAPS bill gives parents that kind of freedom to meet the needs of their children, no matter what those needs are, no matter how those needs may change from kindergarten to high school. And any parents who are listening, you may be nodding your heads. Yeah, kids change in ways that you may not predict, and what they may need to be comfortable in learning. So as I see it, from 2008 to today, Montana has really kept the momentum going and has at all times, and this is culminated in this MAPS bill, is at all times put parents and the well-being and education of children first. And I think that's really what's guiding the state now, and it's pretty beautiful to see.
It is. And as a representative, of parents, I've really felt that they are taking this choice in their children's education more seriously.
Yes.
Just in the last few years, especially. What's caused that? Is this from the pandemic and really paying attention to what your children are doing, at home? Or I guess what has caused parents just in the last few years to really take notice and want options in their children's education?
That's a really great question, and the answer goes from both before COVID and after COVID. So before COVID, I spoke to a lot of parents from all different walks of life. One of the first parents I spoke with years ago, 1994 exactly. I don't think I'll ever forget this woman. She dropped out of school when she was in 8th grade, and then had been living on the streets and dealt drugs a little bit just to keep going, and would just move from house to house on a particular street wherever the party was, and and that was her life. But she also had 2 children. Well, her children, much like some of the kids that I just spoke about who came to my charter school, and they just didn't know what that meant to behave, actually. Well, they'd get kicked out of school every day, and they just wander the streets. And one day, there were a couple nuns who saw these two kids, 8, 10 years old, and walking the streets. I said, shouldn't you be in school? Are you okay? And they said, oh, yeah, but they said to the nuns, we're bad kids. So, they can't have us in school. They kick us out all the time because we're just bad kids. And the nuns asked, well, where do you live? I said, well, we look for the house where a party is, and then we know that, well, Mom's probably going to be there, and so we'll look there, and then we'll stay there. And neither one of those kids had ever, and they couldn't read, they couldn't write, they had no skills whatsoever. But the nuns were participating in a school choice program, so they knew about it. And they went with these children to find their mom, which they did. And the mother, when presented this choice for their child or for their children, these kids can come to our school and we will value their lives and really care for them, was very quick to say, oh yeah, absolutely, right now. There's just no hesitation, no question. And as I talked to her, I was surprised by that. I, I just I just didn't think it was going to go that way, given her lifestyle. And she said to me, "You will never know what it's like to not have an education. You will never know what I know, and it's horrible." And so she was very clear to say she wanted something better for her kids. She did not want her kids to be like her. She wanted her kids to have a future. And she knew exactly what that looked like. She was not living that in any way, shape, or form, but she wanted that for her children. She's just one of many parents that I have met that it goes this way. If you have a child who comes home from school and they're just unhappy, or they're withdrawn, or they're acting out, and then the next morning, time to go to school, and they're yelling and complaining, "I don't want to go to school, I want to go to school." And of course, you're the parent, you're like, "No, you're going to school, this is important." But parents can see, first and foremost, what's going right and what's not going right for their children. So there were a whole lot of parents who could see this, but had either had no means to be able to do anything about it, or they had no knowledge of, what else could I do? But the parents knew what would work for their kids. They just didn't have any means whatsoever to connect to that. When COVID hit, then two things happened. First is we started getting a lot of phone calls from parents from all over the country saying, "Do you know what they're teaching my kids?" I can't tell you how many of those calls came in. Who knew that was going on? Parents were just outraged. They were really mad. And so there seemed to be like a synergy that developed between those parents who knew that their kids needed something else, but they were just lost to be able to do something, and parents who then discovered something is really wrong here, and they did know, and they did have means, and those parents started talking. So COVID really boosted things. It boosted, as much as anything, it boosted the knowledge level of parents, and it also gave parents some drive to say, "Okay, game over. This has to stop. There has to be another way that my child can be educated, that I can access. There just has to be another way." So the demand from parents has gone off the charts. Now, I should also say that this demand and that kind of enthusiasm that we're seeing from parents, not just enthusiasm, but kind of an in-your-face kind of enthusiasm.
Yes.
That has also led to microschooling, and a big jump in homeschoolers as well. With microschooling, you'll have a couple families in a neighborhood. They'll get together. They'll hire a teacher, and the teacher may meet with the children for maybe 1, 2, 3 times a week, whatever. Between the parents and the teacher, they figure out what the kids need, and then the kids have their own instruction that they work on. Other times, oftentimes, the parents with these microschools, they'll meet in churches, because churches have classrooms. They're Sunday school classrooms, and they're available Monday through Friday. So it becomes real handy. Or they may go to somebody's house, or they may go to a community center, but they become very creative in delivering education. And what they're discovering, though, is that there's cost to all that. Okay?
Right.
You want to hire a teacher, and a lot of people do want to hire teachers. And there are so many teachers across the country who just love this idea, that real direct contact with students and being able to be very proactive one day to the next with children. There are a lot of happy teachers out there who are doing this with microschools. The MAPS program that's being proposed right now would allow for that. So a parent could use funding to pay for a teacher, to buy the books they need. If they needed to rent some space, they could do that. They could create their own method of delivering education to their kids. And if they needed, maybe their kids had fallen behind, maybe need some tutoring, okay, well, then they could do that. Or maybe one of the kids is just a beautiful artist and really wants to develop that, well, then that option is available also. So everything is driven by the needs of the kids.
The options this creates and the creativity is really exciting. To give the parents and their children, the students, options is just, it's really great and really exciting being here in the building and seeing this legislation come through. So you had mentioned the courts and you were
Yes.
involved in the Espinoza case.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about those impacts and what that looks like going forward, since that's such a big part of Montana education history?
It is a big part. So the Espinoza case came when the tax credit scholarship program that was enacted in 2015, there was a lawsuit, went through the Montana Supreme Court, and then went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which doesn't happen every day. That was not a normal day at the office. But at issue was this. The Montana Supreme Court said that tax credits were working to allow parents to send their kids to religious schools, and that was against what's called the Blaine Amendment in your Constitution. The Blaine Amendment was common in about 37 other states. At the time that territories became states, there was maybe a little bribery going on between the territories and Congress at that point. Well, yeah, maybe you can be a state, but you have to do a couple things and throw this language into your Constitution. There are some of the western states, I think it's South Dakota where I first saw that. Today, people are still mad about that.
So in a few years,
Yeah,
still
right,
mad.
right, yeah, exactly. But those provisions were really limiting, and they just seemed wrong to everybody, including the U.S. Supreme Court. It said you cannot discriminate against a religious school because they're religious. And the point was not the bearing on the religious school, but rather how it had an impact on the parents. So the parents, under the U.S. Constitution, the Free Exercise Clause, have a right to free exercise of religion. If your state constitution prohibits that, then that provision in your state constitution cannot stand. You cannot use a state constitutional provision to deny anyone a right that they have under the U.S. Constitution. That's what it came down to. So the parents have a right to choose a religious school if that's what they want. Well, the result of that was profound. The Supreme Court said that it was an abomination that this was happening across the country, and so simply said that any state constitution that has these provisions, they are unenforceable. You cannot deny rights under the federal Constitution. End of story. Well, then Maine decided that, well, maybe they could. It was a really bad decision on their part. But then they tried to say, well, yeah, religious schools, they can participate in these school choice programs. Yeah, that's fine, just as long as they don't do any of that religious stuff. I mean, literally, that was in their law. As long as you don't do the religion thing, in your religious school, you can participate. Well, it's ridiculous on its face. But that was a little bit more than what the court in Espinoza ruled. So the U.S. Supreme Court took that case up also. That was Carson versus Bacon. And the court was really unmerciful on the state of Maine and basically said, were you not paying attention when we ruled in the Espinoza case? So apparently you were not paying attention. let us be real clear about this. And the court said something that I thought was really wise and something that we don't talk about, I think, enough, which is simply this. Public schools have their purpose and their way of delivering education. Private schools, and in this case, we were talking about private religious schools, they have their schools and their way of delivering education. And everybody knows there are limits on how you can express religion in the public schools, which that I think is a little bit on shaky ground at this point, but takes a long time for the law to develop. But on the private religious school side, well, yeah, if it's a Catholic school, I think they're going to teach from the perspective of the Catholic faith. If they're a Lutheran school, they'll do the same. I mean, whatever the faith is, that's who they are. It's what they believe, and they will teach your children honestly what they believe. That's just part of it. So it's one thing to. It's just incumbent on all of us to accept that. And this is what the Supreme Court said. You're sending a kid to a religious school. Okay, religion will be taught there. The Constitution is A-okay with that. It's not a problem. And in fact, to deny parents that right to send their child to a religious school, first of all, that's its own problem after Espinoza. But second of all, if the reason why you're doing that is because that religious school will teach from their own faith perspective, yeah, sorry, that's also a violation of the parents' rights under the Free Exercise Clause of the U.S. Constitution.
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty exciting.
Yeah,
both
yeah.
of those cases.
So you've seen a lot in Montana since
Yes.
the last couple of decades. So thank you for all your hard work in Montana and helping give parents choice in their child's freedom. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been just a real pleasure. I love Montana. I do, and I love Montanans. People have been so gracious and welcoming, and again, just truly and honestly dedicated to wanting to do the right thing by kids who people recognize, okay, our kids who are in K-12 today, those are the next leaders of this state, and that matters.
They really are.
Yeah.
So thank you. You've talked a lot about your time in education and education choice and education freedom. How did you become so passionate? Like, what led to where you are today?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. This is actually one of my favorite stories. When I was growing up, I grew up in northeastern Ohio, and I went to all public schools. In fact, I didn't meet anyone who went to a private school until my senior year in high school. I went to a party, and a girl said, "Oh, I'm from Central Catholic High School." And I said, "What is that?" I just had never met anyone. When I was in college, I realized I was suddenly going to school with a lot of kids who were from the East Coast, who had gone to private schools in the East Coast. And it was a little troubling to me that I realized, wait, they learned things that I didn't learn, and why didn't I learn those? Why wasn't that taught in my schools? My parents did what parents will often do. They moved into a different neighborhood so they could go to the best schools. They really stretched the budget, and we ate beans and rye bread for a long time, as I recall as a child, but specifically for that reason. And I didn't really understand it at the time. I just knew that it was a thing that kind of bugged me. Well, then I went on to law school, and as soon as I got out of law school, then I went to work for a small law firm that was in a neighborhood, and a woman walked in one day with her child, her daughter, who was just about to go into high school. And she explained to me that she and her husband had divorced, but her daughter had been going to their church's school for her whole life, and then I discovered that the school at their church was a great school. And she was going to go to the high school that their church operated. However, since the divorce, the husband had become an alcoholic and he had a falling out with the church. And so then he decided he didn't want his daughter going to school with those people that he had just had a falling out with. It had nothing whatsoever to do with money or education or any of that. It was just that he didn't want his daughter to be there. And then he took the position that he believed that then the government, the school boards, they should make the decision on where their child went to school. And he reasoned, well, we're divorced now, and so it's the government who should make this decision, how and where we educate our child. When I asked my client, well, what do you think about that? What's your position? She said, over my dead body. I said, oh. But now, up until that point, she had been rather quiet and very soft-spoken until that moment. I said, well, okay. So we went to court, and typically what happens in these cases, the lawyers will go with their clients. You go up before the judge, and the judge says, okay, it's a post-divorce thing, so counsel, take your clients in the back of the room and, work this out, come up with some kind of agreement, bring it up to me, and I'll see if I like it. Well, that didn't work so well that day because my client said the same thing to her husband's lawyer, the over my dead body thing. And then when we got up to the judge, she said the same thing, maybe a few other choice words to the judge. It's a little tricky. So clearly, we were going to have a trial. We had a 5-day trial. And this trial, well, I didn't know anything about private schools. I hadn't had this experience. So suddenly, I had to learn everything there was about private schools in and out and the public schools and the system. And boy, that was a steep learning curve. So I was working like 24 hours a day to try to prepare. And then I learned that the husband's lawyer was a trial attorney, went to trial almost every day. In 10 years, he had not lost a case.
Wow.
It's a little intimidating. I worked so hard just to prepare for this. So at the end of the trial, it was about 3:30 in the afternoon, and the judge rendered his decision, and we won.
Wow.
I
Congratulations.
was so happy. Thank you. And the only question was, who is the right person or entity to decide where and how a child is educated? Who should decide? Who should make that decision? And the judge said, this is a parent's decision. So when I got home, of course, I hadn't, done laundry or paid any attention to what was going on in the world for quite some time. So I poured a glass of wine, and then I turned on the evening news. Well, I'm feeling good. Let's see what's happening in the world. The top news story that day was about a high school, where when the kids were getting on the bus to go home from school, kids got into an argument, and they started shooting each other. And I realized that is the school that my client's daughter would have gone to the very next day had I lost that case.
On the news that same night.
That same night. And that incident was at 3:30 that afternoon, was at the same moment that the judge rendered his decision in our favor. Now, that still gives me goosebumps even today, thinking about that. That was some 39 years ago.
Yeah, I just got goosebumps.
It was pretty profound. The next morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm waiting for the judge to come into chambers to make sure that he watched the news also to see he had not. And when I told him this, he just fell back in his chair and realized the weight, what it's like to be a judge. This is a very heavy decision. And this decision in particular was just so critical. Well, after that, I just couldn't shake that experience. That was just that really laid heavy on my soul, because I realized this was just one woman with one daughter. How many others are out there? And I learned very quickly that there were a whole lot of kids who needed to be in that situation where their parents could, in fact, make that decision, because the parents know their kids better than anybody else. There's no one in this building at the Capitol, no one else but a child's parent who will know, yeah, something's working, something's not working for my child. And the more I got into it, the more I found ways to be able to take some action, to try to develop school choice, to get scholarships to parents. I mean, I first started advocating for school choice before we had a national movement. So there was no movement. But as it turns out, in Indianapolis, the very first scholarship granting organization was formed there. And I became counsel for the man who started that program. And I met all the parents, and I met the schools, and I saw how it all worked. And it finally came down to this. There was no way then, and there's no way now, that I could ever turn my back on all of these families and all of these kids that I know are out there. We know how to educate the toughest to educate kids. If a child is not being fully educated, that's on us, because we know how to do this, where the toughest kids can thrive. And typically those are the kids then that become really successful because they are grateful to see that they could be successful as adults. I cannot turn away from that. There is no way. And that's been my calling ever since.
Such a great story. Leslie, thank you so much for all your hard work in Montana and around the country, giving parents the choice in their children's education. It really means a lot to us here in Montana, so thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much.